Okay, welcome back, economists. We are here to think about one of the most significant market structures under the topic of market power as market failure. If we're thinking about the type of market that has the most market power and as a result is the biggest source of market failure of the four types of market structures that we're thinking about, monopoly is easily the biggest contributor to that. Okay, so if you played the board game Monopoly, you know that the whole point of that game is to become the sole owner at the end of the thing of all of the stuff, right? So when we're talking about a monopoly, what we mean is that is one business is the industry. Okay. So it's really important that you don't confuse that with there not being much to think about or there not being much to know. There's a lot going on here with monopoly, and the government needs to consider these things if they're going to have some kind of policy response to deal with this type of market failure, right? So one business is the industry. So because of that, usually the demand for products that monopolies sell, usually monopolies only end up selling one thing, usually the demand is going to be very inelastic. So going back to our determinants of PED, remember that one of the determinants of what makes something elastic or inelastic in terms of its demand is the number of substitutes. Obviously, if one business is the industry, there's not going to be any substitutes. So it's just going to depend on the extent to which what the monopoly is selling is a necessity or not. So one of the most infamous examples of a monopoly that eventually had to be broken up is Standard Oil. If you've taken a U.S. history course, you've probably seen the one political cartoon with the octopus and all of the arms are reaching out and grabbing hold of different things like the government and it's not a good situation because Standard Oil, they didn't behave themselves. They were probably did a bunch of bad things that were ultimately not good for the U.S. economy. So monopolies are a problem for that reason. Why do monopolies exist? They exist because, well, first of all, the business that came up is a really effective one. Monopolies are massive businesses usually. And they possess economies of scale. They're super efficient, at least from the standpoint, maybe not being productively efficient, but they have really massive supply chains. They have a pretty low average cost in comparison to what their competitors might have been, and they've been so big and so powerful that they've managed to push out their competition. Sometimes brand loyalty can happen. Sometimes monopoly can happen as a result of brand loyalty. There is such a thing as a natural monopoly. That's another diagram for another time. But in that way, there's a natural lack of competition where it's just not physically possible for two businesses to provide the same good or the same service. But there can also be legal monopolies. This is probably the most common type. This usually exists in the world of pharmaceuticals. Okay, so if you're going to develop a prescription drug, those are very expensive. There's a lot of startup costs up front. There's a lot of research and development to go through all the different stages of trials for that drug to reach to market. It's not only very expensive, but it takes a long time. So the businesses that do front all of that startup capital and all of that money, governments like to reward them for a patent or a copyright. So they are the exclusive producer of that thing. That's a reward from the government to say, look, we need effective medicines in our society to be healthy. And, here's a reward for contributing to that, right? They can last too long, and that can be a problem in terms of pricing and things. But that's some of the reasons why monopolies happen. As we started off the video with, if you are the business, you have 100%. If your business is the industry, you have 100% market power, and that is a massive source of market failure. You don't have to be an expert in history to identify some problems that have happened with monopolies over the course of history. What monopolies do specifically that leads to market failure is they restrict output. They do this to sacrifice profits, right? They don't produce at the allocatively efficient point. They restrict output so they can make more profits. They do the same thing with their prices. If you sell a product with inelastic demand, it only makes sense from the business's point of view to raise your prices. You will increase your revenue that way. What monopolies also do is they limit choices. They really don't like competitors, and they will go out of their way to limit competition and even sometimes prevent competition from developing within that market. That was certainly the case with Standard Oil. So that kind of all fits the definition of anti-competitive behavior. Monopolies do a lot of things that are not good on a national scale. Usually they mistreat their workers because if you have an education in that field, you really don't have another option if you want to stay and work in that business. The wages usually aren't good. They stop new products from entering the market, and they usually are not very good for the environment. So for all those reasons, the government has a pretty significant responsibility to regulate monopolies and try to make sure that they don't happen. So for that reason, sometimes it can be difficult to pin down a concrete example of monopolies happening right now because the government, pretty much any national government in the world is going to go out of their way to make sure that monopolies don't get out of control. So just one last point here. Monopolies really have no reason to be efficient. They have no competitors, right? That's the great thing about competition is it makes you better, right? What makes for a better business? They're more efficient. Even though monopolies have economies of scale and they can produce at a really low marginal cost, that doesn't mean they do so. They don't do that because they're prioritizing profit. So monopolies are neither productively efficient. We find that by locating the intersection of marginal cost and average cost, right? They don't produce at the lowest possible point on the average cost curve, and they are also not allocatively efficient. They're not necessarily supplying what the market demands because they don't have to. They can make a really impressive amount of profit both in the short run and in the long run. That's probably an assumption I missed here, is that monopolies are almost always profitable. If you are a monopoly and you're not profitable, you have a pretty rubbish business. So they're also not allocatively efficient, as in they're not producing where supply meets demand, right? So I've drawn this graph here. When we covered externalities, this looks pretty similar. Remember that externalities are a type of market failure. This doesn't exactly show an externality, but it does show the idea of marginal cost and marginal benefit. So if you can remember, our marginal benefit curve is essentially demand. Our marginal cost curve is essentially supply, right? And so I've marked that off as, it says the price of AE, that means to be allocatively efficient, and then the allocatively efficient quantity. We're essentially going to show this on this monopoly graph I'm going to draw for you here. Okay, so again, one of our assumptions here is that we have inelastic demand because there are no substitutes. So let's start there. Remember, it's important to label your demand curves also as your average revenue curves. For a point we're going to address later, okay? And remember that our marginal revenue curves are going to have about a little bit double the negative slope of the demand curve, okay? So there's our marginal revenue curve. So we need to also add in, obviously, marginal cost, okay? That will look kind of the same as we've always drawn it in whatever market we're thinking of. Again, that's essentially the supply curve. So our process is the same. We're going to find the point at which profits are maximized when marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Okay, that's going to give us our quantity here. Okay, and then we're going to establish our price. Monopolies can get away with charging a pretty high price because they have inelastic demand, right? So then the other point, well, we also forgot our average cost curve. That's important to put in there as well. Remember that average cost intersects with marginal cost at the lowest point, okay? So then where the quantity curve meets the average cost curve, then we get cost per unit, okay? And again, all of this is abnormal profit, okay? There's no distinction here between the short run and the long run, at least when it comes to this graph, because this is the long run reality for monopolies, because there are barriers, right? There's not going to be another business, at least very likely, that will come along and compete with this business, because there are so many barriers. Usually with the monopoly, you're dealing with a number of different types of barriers and not just one. So a couple more things to think about. This is a profit maximizing business. So for that reason, they are not going to be allocatively efficient, right? So allocatively efficient would mean you're producing where marginal cost equals average revenue. Remember, that's the same thing as the demand curve, right? So this is the point of being allocatively efficient, and that is not where they're producing here. This would be the quantity of being allocatively efficient, okay? They are also not productively efficient. In other words, they are not producing at the lowest point in their average cost curve, right? So this, we're just going to connect that down a little bit. They are not productively efficient either, okay? So, yeah, there's a lot of different forms of market failure going on here. All of this stuff, you know, damage to the environment, anti-competitive behavior, fewer choices, higher prices, multiple types of inefficiency. So this is the type of market that is the biggest threat to market failure, and it's for that reason that governments need to think carefully about how to prevent these and how to deal with them when they do happen. Now, conveniently for us, this is also the diagram for an oligopoly, right? So an oligopoly is at least a collusive one, right? Collusion means that two parties that are meant to be competing are working together instead. With a collusive oligopoly, you have two or maybe three businesses in an industry, and instead of competing and trying to establish the lowest price, they work together and they set an artificially high market price where everyone can make profits, probably profits greater than they would be able to make if they competed instead of colluded. So if multiple businesses collude instead of competing, this is what our diagram looks like. Because if all of these businesses that technically sell different things, if they all work together, they essentially function like one business, in which case they're working like a monopoly, and you can illustrate that market structure this way, right? So this is the short-run monopoly, this is the long-run monopoly, and this is also an oligopoly, okay? So all three of those forms of markets can be illustrated with this thing. Monopolies are usually going to be illegal. Collusive oligopolies are definitely illegal, pretty much in every country. So there's a real need for government intervention here to step in and limit the power of these businesses. Usually what that means is they break the business up into sort of smaller pieces, and then those smaller pieces have to compete against each other. That sort of takes the form of antitrust legislation to limit the power of monopolies because they are a significant source of market failure. Okay, so a simple idea here with the monopoly, but there's a lot going on when we try to apply some economic concepts. Okay, so hopefully all of this I didn't make all of this too confusing, and we will cover the other type of monopoly, which is a natural monopoly. We'll cover that in a later video. Thanks, guys.